Good afternoon, everyone. Ian Garside here, and welcome to the third of a three-webinar series hosted by Asset Dynamics and ProjectMax. The webinar series is entitled Asset Management Done Well and is intended to be informative. It will allow water service asset management staff to think about planning the improvement activities at the same time as considering the current and long and near-term legislative and organisational changes. As we know, reform will put more pressure on us prioritising investment decisions, and the webinar series addresses three core areas to act on now, during, and before reform. The topic of the first webinar was the levels of service aligning decision-making with what matters to stakeholders, and the second one was talking about asset management frameworks. Today's webinar will examine how asset data can be used to inform decisions and is entitled Asset Data and Information, the Lifeblood of Asset Management. Data and information are essential inputs to any asset management decision-making process and to the safe and efficient delivery of work, but not many asset managers have confidence in their organization's asset information. Addressing data quality gaps and shortcoming requires good understanding of the needs for the data to be driven by business needs and good management and governance. Today's webinar will feature Rob Blakemore and Jules Congalton. Many people in the water industry know Rob. He's been in the industry 46 years, I think. He's a former president of Water New Zealand and the winner of numerous awards. Jules is an experienced asset information manager with a demonstrable history of leading asset management improvements in the utilities, mainly in the electricity industry, and is a certified asset management assessor. Just a word on housekeeping. The webinar will be about 30 minutes long. Rob will go first, Jules second, and that'll be followed by a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat area, and we will answer or endeavour to ask Rob and Jules to answer the questions during that session. And after the webinar, you'll be sent a recording of it. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Ian, and hello, everybody. Number three. As Ian said, this webinar, the last of the series of three, is around the data challenges that we're facing in the water industry and a way forward, really, in terms of data management. If we think back to the previous webinar, we gave the concept of an asset framework with all those components that need to go into a chassis and to build, over time, your mature asset management approaches. Now, data is what I think of as the glue to that framework. It cements the things together, so those decision-making, the overlaps, the interactions, and the individual decisions of all of those different parts of the framework that are needed on that framework can be made. There is a risk, though. It's that if you try to meet everyone's needs separately, you can create multiple silos and multiple data systems. And so the whole thrust of this webinar really is around the fact that data management needs to be holistically planned, and once it's planned, holistically managed, with interactions between all those people that get the data, that, if you like, are the governors of the data, and those people that use it. So if you look back, and I've done a lot of this, looking back for the last 120 to 140 years in terms of the water industry in New Zealand, it's been fragmented. And for that period of time, we started off with borough and county councils in the late 1880s. And in those situations, everyone was doing things their own way and trying to meet their own needs. But we've had various attempts in my time to consolidate data systems and data collection. We've had performance benchmarking programs, even ones before the current Water New Zealand benchmarking program that have gone underway. They've had their problems in terms of the consistency of the interpretation of that data. I was around when we had a national tender for a data management system. It went to Hansen, and that system got adopted and then disposed of by many people, and then other systems adopted. We've had an attempt to generate metadata standards for the water industry with a business case preparation for those standards. Unfortunately, no home could be found for those standards, and they were partially completed. And in latter times, we've had the NTU and their attempt to bring in Infor the processes and if you like, the schemas that go with that. The thing that I make an observation about all these attempts is that often we assume that every utility's needs were the same. And of course, that's not the case. And in doing that, we try to derive solutions before the problems were well defined. It's the old story about going on the journey before you own a destination. So in the end, we had multiple destinations, all these signboards that went in different directions because we were trying to address different people's needs. And then if we go forward now, and we've discussed this in previous webinars, but I just want to recap. We've got increasing pressure on evidence-based decisions. It's around no matter how we think about it, that we're going to have constrained funding on top of historic underfunding. And in that situation, the established investment needs that we all know we want to plan for will exceed the money available. So we're going to need to justify our prices and our charges. We're going to have better knowledge of operational performance and the effectiveness of the spending operationally. We need to understand our residual risks because we're not going to get out of that by spending money, and they're going to have to be managed operationally because there won't be enough funding to solve it with CapEx. We're going to have an increasing focus on capital project performance monitoring. I already heard on the news this morning about the high cost of infrastructure in this country compared with overseas. And of course, increasingly and higher needs for stakeholder engagement. Then if you carry on further, we're going to have multiple regulators and multiple reporting requirements, whether they're regional council, Tamata Arawa, the economic regulator, health and safety, and numerous others. We will be wanting to think, whether we like it or not, go forward, of one water, not three. Whether or not reform ends up with bringing on all three waters, we don't know. But in the end, you can't get away from the fact that they all interact. Risks need to be understood and managed, and then they have to be documented. That's a key fundamental requirement of all the regulators. We have to have key decisions that are going to be made and supported with evidence and then owned by ourselves without actually saying, and so in the end, the responsibility falls back on the utility, not on other parties. There will be, of course, because of these regulators, external scrutiny and audits that have to be addressed. Then on top of that, we are riding this renewals bow wave. We have uncertainty about our end of life of infrastructure, whether depending on how much data we've collected and how much information we've got, but there's still a lot of uncertainty, and we're going to have to have more information. The condition data methods, condition data assessment data methods in the past, and the way of assessing confidence in the past has been highly variable. We've had unplanned failures that create reactive renewals and not planned renewals, which means that the opportunity to get data is sometimes often lost. And then on top of that, you've got this huge pressure from other works going on at the same time as the renewals bow wave, from roads, other utilities, new developments, and they may override our renewals planning, which means that we're going to fall back on operational solutions if we don't get CapEx done, and we're going to have the evidence that this backlog of renewals is starting to climb because of the pressure on our infrastructure. Going ahead, we've got growing populations in many towns, and then changing customer expectations. So we've got to have infrastructure capacity deficits, greater reliability and quality expectations on the performance of that infrastructure, and a very high dependence on modelling, all forms of modelling. Natural hazard challenges, including climate change, continuously place pressure on us. We have new knowledge after every event and new research all the time. Our risk tolerances seem to be decreasing, and our conventional infrastructure is becoming less viable as we understand the vulnerability of that infrastructure to these hazards. So what does all this mean? All those issues that I've just talked about require data if we're going to start making decisions about what we do in each of those circumstances. In the past, we've reacted as the need arises without the time for coordinated planning of the data needs. So we do bits here, bits there. We make decisions with variable quality data because we're forced to, and we have variable understanding of the confidence in that data that we're using. We're often vulnerable to accepting software solutions made by others for others without actually determining whether those software solutions are going to meet our needs. We end up, because of the situation we're in, with poor data history that can enable those good decisions. And we then finally end up, of course, with multiple data systems to meet multiple individuals' needs. So before I hand over to Jules, there's some final points here which lead into what he's going to talk about. Data is something we all need, but we need to have a clear strategy with clear responsibilities about what's required so that we understand the interactions between everybody's needs. We need to understand what data is critical and then focus on that data rather than trying to solve everything all at once. And of course, with getting better data, we have to have better capability either to collect it, to manage it, or to use it. So I'm going to hand over to Jules now to enable him to just give us a bit of an insight about the approach that we can take in a utility with good data management. Thanks, Jules.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. Hopefully you can see that slide there. So yeah, as Rob mentioned, I'm Jules Congalton from Asset Dynamics. So I'll talk about ways of closing the data gaps that Rob's outlined. Just a reminder, put any questions into the chat and we can go through those at the end. So Rob has outlined some of the gaps in asset data when managing water infrastructure and why having good data is critical. And we've probably all experienced situations where the data we're using is not as good as we'd like it to be. Either we don't have the required data or there's challenges making good use of the data that we do have. So how do we best go about closing the data gap and how can we establish a systematic and sustainable approach to addressing these issues? So I thought I should start by clarifying what sort of data we're talking about. So when we talk about asset management data and information, we mean the data that describes the assets, the water infrastructure, as well as the data that's used for all of the asset management processes. So for example, this includes the data needed to understand future demand, planning the work to be done on the assets, and operating the network of assets. And what we can see here on this slide is some definitions from the Institute of Asset Management, from their guidelines around asset information, strategy, standards, and data management. And we can see what sort of data is typically included. We've got physical asset data, so data about the physical assets, the asset register. We've got the spatial and location information, like the GIS data. There's the relationships between assets, so what assets are installed where and how they're all connected. We've got the work management data, so planning all the work, the long-term and annual work plans, managing the work to be done, and then having that full history of all the work done on these assets. We've got performance data, so understanding whether assets are meeting the required service levels. The condition data around asset risk and likelihood of failure, and cost data, and there may well be other sorts of data that you might be relevant for your organisation as well. But that gives a bit of a sense of the sort of thing we're talking about. And I'll talk about asset information when I go through this today, and by that I mean asset management data and information. So there's all the types of data, all these types of data, and all the data required to manage and operate the water assets. So fundamental to improving asset information is having those clear roles and responsibilities. Everyone has a data role. Infrastructure organisations are increasingly becoming data organisations. You're focusing on data collection, management, and then the utilisation of that data. So there's three key data-related roles which I'll go through, which have been shown to work well in infrastructure organisations. And they come from the public health sector. So the first is data consumers. And data consumers decide what data is required to achieve business goals, and they also determine what level of data quality is required in order for them to deliver on their responsibilities. Data custodians plan the best way to acquire data, and they implement quality assurance processes to make sure data is fit for purpose, and then take corrective action where issues are identified. And data collectors, which may be people or devices like sensors, they're responsible for collecting data to the specified quality standards. So their responsibilities are simply to collect data to the required data collection standards. And if these roles are clear, then teams are clear on what's required of them, and then they can deliver the required outcomes. Rob, is there anything that you want to add on this point?
Just a point here, and I know in many small organisations, it's very hard to resource some of these roles, especially the data custodians when you've got multiple services to provide, and also often the data collectors are the consumers, and we've had pressure on getting, if data collection, actually the people that consume the data think they've collected it, and then find that it's not there. It can be a very frustrating exercise. So, as I said, in small organisations, often you get overlaps between these roles.
Excellent, thanks, Rob. So when we're looking to improve data, we need to start with the why, and in this context, it's why do we need the data? So we need to start with the asset management processes that actually consume the data, rather than starting with the data itself or the supporting technology. In our experience, it's quite common that organizations start thinking about data quality when they're implementing new technology or a new computer system. And this often starts well with good intentions, but as they go through the technology project, the focus shifts to getting the technology live and the data quality goes back onto the to-do list. So we need a more strategic approach to addressing data quality. So implementing asset information governance takes a more strategic approach with data improvement, and it makes it part of core business for managing infrastructure. So rather than starting with the data, the starting point is the business outcomes that are required from asset management. And this would be your stakeholder levels of service, could be the safety requirements around the assets, and also financial performance. And these are the goals that would be documented in your asset management strategy. And this provides a top-level information goals, which are then typically captured in the asset information strategy. And that's going to determine what information we actually need to achieve those asset management goals. And the asset information strategy also needs to consider how the organization is changing, and therefore how data requirements are changing. If, for example, you might be introducing new decision-making methods which have new data requirements. And so the asset information strategy needs to consider how these new methods will work and what data is required for those new methods to be successful and sustainable. So the asset information strategy is owned by some kind of asset information governance or prioritization group that's cross-functional. So this includes the data consumers, the people who need the data to deliver on their accountabilities. It includes the data custodians who are responsible for data quality and ensuring people have access to data and can use it. And it includes data collectors, the people who are actually out there in the field collecting data and ensuring that it's available. And then that asset information governance group can consider what gaps exist in the asset information and therefore what work might be required to close them. From there, they can start thinking about working with the data because then they've got a good understanding of why it's needed. And we need to understand how it connects up to the mission of the organization and the specific business processes that deliver that mission. And we can then form up the projects needed to improve the data with a clear understanding of the business benefits. And these improvement projects might include things like training, better tools and systems, or new processes. And then finally, we need to have some sort of monitoring and reporting capabilities so that the governance group has an up-to-date understanding of the state of the data. This allows them to track the effectiveness of improvements so that the asset information governance group is getting feedback on the current state of the data and how we're doing it in terms of improvements. Anything from your side, Rob, that you want to add to that? Oh, you're on mute there, Rob.
I muted myself because I'm very conscious here. I'm in a very windy town today. I'm conscious of this noise. Again, when we talked about resourcing, this is so applicable to any organisation. But I do know when you have multiple services, often that's one service can dominate over another. If they are more mature in data collection, a good example I can think of is roading, and so. I do think that when water organisations become their own being, this is going to be made a lot simpler and a lot clearer because you're not subject to the needs of others from other services.
Good point, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So the next question then is, I guess, practically, how do we go about improving the data once we've identified that what the improvements are, and then ensuring that it's fit for purpose? And so asset information has a life cycle, and those life cycle processes support delivering on that asset information strategy. So ensure the processes work well, they need to be designed, implemented, monitored and improved. And the processes may vary, but they might look something like this. So we might have some processes around planning asset information improvements. So that's including the business priorities and initiatives, which informs that asset information improvement plan. And the governance group can then agree the priorities based on their team's needs for asset information. We've got some process around implementing information improvements. So where there's a new requirement or a change in the way existing information is captured or managed. And there may be a number of options for acquiring information, like deriving it from data we already have, capturing it through sensors, or receiving it from another party, like a supplier. And there needs to be a plan for checking data as fit for purpose on an ongoing basis, like using a data quality dashboard. And the total lifecycle cost of the data need to be understood to ensure that the value of the data exceeds the cost of collecting and managing it. And then it's also important that information requirements, when they change, are communicated to those affected, and particularly to data collectors, so they're informed of new data requirements and why these are needed by the organisation. Managing master data is important for ensuring data is structured and things like lookup lists are manageable and kept up to date. Changes to master data often have far-reaching effects across the organisation, so master data changes need to be peer-reviewed and approved before being implemented. Registering new assets involves the steps that need to be taken when a new asset is added to the asset portfolio. Includes things like asset numbering, updating the asset register, and potentially reconfiguring the operational management systems, like updating the network model. And capturing asset information includes things like capturing condition and performance data, updating asset systems, and updating things like GIS. And these processes might occur in response to a variety of triggers, things like inspections, maintenance, and other data collection processes. So monitoring asset information quality involves identifying data quality issues and their causes, and a new data issue or group of issues may be identified through several channels like data quality checks, field checks, or potentially the occurrence of a network incident that's related to the data quality. But as the nature of data quality issues can vary, it's the cause of the issue that must be understood before considering what corrections required. And extracting asset information covers those steps needed to get the information out. And often this is self-service, but in some cases there may be support required from experts. But there's also supports all the regulatory reporting requirements that Rob mentioned. So together, all of these processes support delivering on the asset information strategy. And one way of looking at this is treating data as an asset and then planning for its full life cycle. But not all data is created equal. So it's essential, some data is essential to get right, and therefore that kind of requires a greater level of rigor. And so to understand what data is critical, we need to understand what information is needed to ensure safe and efficient management of water infrastructure. So one of the ways we can do this is to understand each asset management process and what data is required for that process to execute effectively. So in order to link data to the value it provides, we need to understand that operating model and how that data is consumed. And this approach focuses on business value, starting with what data is needed to deliver the business and then going from there. So we can do this through like a process decomposition or breaking down the processes. So on the left, we have some typical major process areas for asset management. And if we consider asset planning, then this can generally be broken down into a range of different capabilities. For example, shutdown and outage strategy, capital investment planning, decision-making and resourcing strategy. And if we look at capital investment planning, we can break that down into some sub-processes, which could include modelling asset performance, so how well it's supporting the services that it needs to, and modelling asset health to understand the current state of the assets in terms of condition and risk. And it makes sense to have different risk models for different asset classes in the water network, as different asset classes have different risks and therefore different data inputs. So in this example, we've expanded out the key data inputs for the gravity mains risk model. And this allows us to identify the data points held in our information systems that enable us to determine the probability of failure for this asset class. So we've gone from our top level processes on the left, we've identified the set of data points needed to be correct or fit for purpose in order to be making good decisions around investing in or renewing gravity mains. And we can then apply the data quality checks across that to determine if the data points held in the systems are fit for purpose. So this example shows that we've got some data quality issues with some of these data points. Some are marked in red, indicating that they're critical to the capital investment planning process and ensuring that it's producing meaningful and accurate results. And in many cases, these sort of checks can be automated and run daily, so we can understand where the data quality issues are, and we can start planning improvement actions. Anything that you want to add, Rob, before I move on to the next one?
I mean, you've taken one specific example. Of course, even within the area of capital investment, you've got a whole lot of other things that will drive investment, whether it's renewals or levels of service or growth, and they will then, in their own way, determine the specific data needs and the specific data gaps. But it's important to do this work so that you can know what your focus should be to improve. And this is an example of something that's in water industries that can be a lot more complex. Still worth doing the exercise.
Excellent. Thanks for that. So I guess from here, once we identify where the critical issues are to the key processes that need to be got right, we need to understand the causes of the errors or the nature of the error. Like, is it just a one-off data error, or is it systematic? Is it still occurring in today's environment, or is it some historic issue from 40 or 50 or 60 years ago? So if we're carrying out these checks on a daily basis, then we can look at how data quality is trending for each of these critical data points, and then we can plan the appropriate improvement actions. So if we've got a data defect trend where it's declining, like in this one, then it's likely to be a historical issue, and the data quality is improving over time. And that may be because older assets are being replaced with new ones, and the data that's coming in now is good. It may be that there's a data quality improvement program already in place, or potentially regular inspection of the assets are helping to improve the data. And in this case, the action for a declining trend may just be to monitor it to ensure that it trends towards zero. However, if we've got a data quality check where the trend is increasing, then it's probably a live issue, and the action here is not to try and fix the data, because the minute it gets fixed, it's going to be problematic again. So we need to understand the root cause and address that. So once the root cause is addressed, then we may want to go ahead and correct the data. And the root cause could be things like training issues, or it could be an organizational culture issue where data quality is not valued. But these sorts of things need to be addressed in quite different ways. And so the benefit of this approach is that we understand the risks of incomplete or inaccurate data to delivering on our levels of service. We're creating a linkage between the data that's held in our systems and the ultimate business goals that we're trying to achieve. And that's really useful for forming the basis for a business case for investing and improving in data, because we're understanding what we're looking to get out of it. We're also able to pinpoint data quality issues and select the correct approach to improve it. And if we don't do this, we can spend a lot of money trying to fix data when we should actually be trying to address the root cause. We can also monitor the effectiveness of any investment in improving data quality, because we can track how well that's going, making sure we're getting the outcomes that we're after. And it also provides a wider set of assurance that we have systems and processes in place that's going to lead to continual improvement of data quality. And that's assuming, of course, that it's appropriately resourced and there's accountabilities in place. So finally, in the same way for building any capability, there needs to be this ecosystem of kind of enabling elements to have certainty that we're going to achieve those goals. And it's the same with making sure that we've got the right information about the assets that we're managing. For asset information, there's 5 subject areas or capabilities that are identified by the Global Forum for Maintenance and Asset Management. And these subject areas are like the pillars for delivering reliable and complete asset information. So the first is the asset information strategy, which I've talked a bit about already. So the primary role of the asset information strategy is to align the management of asset information with the organization's objectives. And this strategy is essential because it defines both the present and those future information requirements. We'll cover things like roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities for asset information. The degree to which it's formalized might depend on the size and nature of the company, but regardless of whether it's a formal document or not, there needs to be a common understanding across the team of the key elements of the strategy. An asset information standard is a specification of consistent structure and format for collecting and storing asset information. And so these standards build on the foundations of the strategy. It includes things like data collection standards for field staff, things like as-built, asset changes, GPS capture, inspection data, all those sorts of data. Configuration management is the identification, recording, and monitoring of an asset's functional and physical status. So this includes consideration of the impact of configuration changes on the operation of the overall asset system. And it includes the controls that are in place to manage risks associated with configuration changes. Asset information systems, this is the hardware and software of the systems that store asset information. And regardless of where the responsibility for asset information systems sit in the organization, these systems need to be aligned with meeting the goals in the asset information strategy. And some of the considerations in this subject area are things like security, accessibility, functionality, and just the general ability of those information systems to support achieving those asset management objectives. And then data and information management. This covers all the data held in the information systems. Data and information have that defined life cycle, starting with planning, it goes through acquisition, storage, use, improvement, and the eventual archiving. And to ensure that data is fit for purpose, quality or data quality needs to be embedded throughout each stage of the life cycle. And finally, that asset information governance group gets visibility of the state of the data and the trends in data quality, and that provides the context for setting direction and priorities for data improvement. Anything that you want to add to this one, Rob?
No, I think you've done I think it'll be interesting to get the views of people here as to where they sit with this approach, or whether they've lurched into one particular area, or whether whether they have a strategy, where they're at with their standards, those sorts of things, where they're at with their building the processes that can allow them to configure a system. So I know these are all issues, but be interested to see what the views of the audience is.
Yeah, that's a good point. It would be interesting to hear. Often what we see is, organizations have strengths in one area. They might be very good at systems or very good at their standards, but we really kind of need to have at least some capability in all areas to have that kind of embedded and ongoing, sort of improvement culture. So yeah, it's a good point. It would be good to hear where people are at in terms of that. Improving asset management, data and information in a sustainable way does require these capabilities to be established and improved. And this ensures those improvements get sort of embedded and they can be built on over time. So to sort of identify strengths or any gaps in the current set of capabilities in the organization, it can be useful to understand the current state. And one way to do this is through a capability maturity model for asset information. So business capability maturity assessments, they provide guidance on current state and target state and any gaps in the current sets of capability. And these maturity models provide a bit of a lens to understand both those strengths and opportunities in a particular domain. And they've been shown to assist organizations to improve their capabilities and therefore their outcomes that they're achieving for their stakeholders. So this asset information maturity model was published in 2021, and it's based on the asset information subject areas. It's got these 5 maturity levels from ad hoc to aware, defined, managed, and optimized. And if we look at it, one example for, say, an asset information strategy capability area, it's got the 5 levels look like this. So at level 1, there's no strategy. Level 2, the document is written and approved. At level 3, there's some implementation begun with sort of communication of that and implementation of it. Level 4, it's implemented throughout the organization, and then level 5, we're into continual improvement. So the value of the model, the maturity model, is it allows you to benchmark the organization and outlines some next steps to take in each subject area. And that's been used in a number of a few New Zealand infrastructure organisations. And what we've seen is that organisations may have these specific strengths, but to get sustainable improvement, they really need some capability across all 5 areas. So yeah. Just to wrap up, a few key takeaways.
I think I'll take my first 2. I think, Jules.
Great, sounds good.
So if you summarise where I think I got to, is that if you don't know where you want to go with your data, you probably won't get there. And knowing where you want to go is the first step. So getting the right data and getting value from it requires integrated and joined up planning across the organisation, so to make sure that the collectors, the custodians, and the consumers are all connected. The second point, Jules, I think was spend time planning. It's the old story. time needs to be spent planning data and data management with the people who need it and those that will collect it. It's the old story. Underestimate the planning phase, and it will all go horribly wrong. So there's all those, as I said, there's all those phases: the collection, the use, and how it will be maintained that need to be planned, and for all your different needs.
Excellent, thanks. So you're building on Rob's point there about planning. Not all data is equal, so we need to understand what data is most critical. Some data has a really significant impact on things like getting the right investment plans, on safety, working around the assets, and on regulatory compliance. So therefore, it's important to identify which data that's critical so you can then prioritize and plan those data improvements. And if you don't do this, you can end up wasting a lot of time and money in the wrong areas. And this approach also supports building the business case for data improvements, because you know how that data is impacting the business outcomes. And finally, improving data requires developing asset information capabilities. One way of starting this process is with an asset information maturity assessment, because if you understand the organization's current set of capabilities, you can decide where you want to be and then make a plan to do the improvements where they're required. So that brings me to the end of what I'm going to cover off today. Thank you very much for all your attention. I'm going to hand back to Ian now to facilitate questions and answers, and please put any questions that you've got in the chat. So over to you, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Jules. Good double act there, Rob and Jules. There's a comment that Ashley's made here, and it says if the industry is getting serious about data, we need to value the collection, management, and maintenance of data, and the systems and the teams. And I'm adding to this resourcing. That's a very, very good point, Ashley. A question from Chris here. Do you see the possibility of statutory implementation of the National Engineering Design Standards and Asset Data Standards as important to support these processes?
I think the simple answer to that is yes. I mean, there was a huge effort, wasn't there? And we nearly, from what I understand, nearly crossed the line in getting these things done to get common standards, because one of the most frustrating things is where you all have differences around the country, so that it doesn't allow comparison, it doesn't allow performance metrics and all those things. So the simple answer is yes. There will always be individuals' needs, or individual utilities' needs, but to get as much as we can across the line in terms of national standards was a great initiative.
Just for the thought on that, some of you might be involved in roading as well, but I've also got some involvement in the roading side and the asset management data standard there, which I understand there's some work required for different organisations to kind of comply with that. But I understand the bigger picture is that it's expected to save around $70 million a year in sort of joined up planning synergies across the network. So, I think there is definitely value in targeting a sector standard.
Just another comment, Chris, where with the metadata standards, where it fell apart, in my view, was that it got there to do the simple metadata standards that describe an asset, basically. But when you got into schemas that were going to affect the way you made decisions, then there was a lot of disagreement. And to do that, maybe we've just got to have respect for those differences in that case. I mean, the one I can think of is the criticality approach. So yeah, maybe we just have to have systems that can have the respect for differences and also accept what we can, which is common.
Maybe I could just comment on Ashley's comment around value. I think it's an interesting one about valuing data. And there's a move to treat data as an asset, in which case we need to understand its value. In some organisations, some infrastructure organisations, there's discussion of data on the balance sheet, which puts a value on it, and that then flows through to having a more of a kind of a structured conversation around investing in it and where to invest in it. So I think it's it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and exactly the point that Greg Preston made. Thanks for that, Greg. Question from Joe here. Thanks, Jules and Rob. How do you feel the water industry's capability is to collect and handle data from a service person to decision maker? Do you see there are any gaps you can share with us, and how can we improve that or close the gaps?
I'll give a view here. There are huge gaps, and it's a challenge that we're going to have for the industry. As someone who got very involved with the training of service persons and people, field-based people in former years, where we encouraged them to be able to understand and data systems and understand drawings and then also collect data. It's frustrating when this doesn't happen. And I'd like to think, I might be a bit naive, that when people understand why they want something and why it's needed, they find a better reason to do it. At the moment, I know field staff in the collection thing are often pressured. They don't feel that data collection is something that they need, but unfortunately, what happens is that they pay the penalty for that later on, and then we end up not understanding why things are failing, why things need augmenting, and because we haven't got the data that could have been collected at the time, especially with buried assets. But the other comment I will make is that in the data, if you like, stewardship area, there has to be knowledge not just of data systems, but of a water system. There has to be a connection between those people that are responsible for the data and an understanding of what is important and what is critical and what are the risks in a water system. So that's a whole area of knowledge gap I believe exists, especially as we get bigger organizations where there'll be more and more people just involved with data management.
Thanks, Rob. A question from Jesse here. Is there a preferred, in quotes, asset classification metadata system for use across New Zealand, e.g. like Uniclass used in the UK? What's your view on the most appropriate one to be adopted and by whom?
I think this comes back in a way to asset management data standards, and I think there are some different sector-wide ones being developed in New Zealand, like I guess the roading one. The new ISO 5513 standard is asset management data standard. It doesn't specify a detailed classification structure; it's more about guidance, but it does have in the Appendix A a high-level structure for asset management data. So that's one possible starting point.
I'm hesitant to say there's a best system because it depends on the asset, depends on its use, it depends on its application. And again, that's a communication issue. And I think there needs to be that discussion between all parties before you say this is the best system.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's excellent. Thank you. A question from Willem. How does digital and engineering or BIM fit into these frameworks, and what benefits do you see from this concept?
I think in general, they're very enabling. Well, I guess the digitalization, digital twins is a kind of a driver for good data, and some of the BIM modeling is very powerful as a mechanism for capturing it in a structured way. I guess it comes back to again understanding the value that data is contributing to asset management processes and therefore to achieving service levels. So it's very much I think the focus needs to start with the why. So what's the value for stakeholders? And then implementing the BIM or the digital twins or digitalization that will enable that, and then measuring whether those benefits are actually being delivered for stakeholders through those changes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's all very well going down an advanced approach to, if you like, data collection and data display, but it's really got to be appropriate for the particular application. And it's the old maturity thing, isn't it? Why have an advanced car when you in some situations you can put up with the old Model T or parts of the Model T. So horses for courses.
Okay, and Richard's got a question here. Has anybody looked back at the NTU's draft national data standard, which was intended for 3 waters entities? Is that worth looking at again? And I think Anne has said we are. I don't know, Anne, where you're from. Perhaps you could put that in the chat. But I think that the question there is around, looking back at NTU. Well, Anne's from Queenstown Council. So did you want to comment on that, Rob? Rob, Jules probably wouldn't know.
I think I've already commented on this, is that it depends on, I can see a place for national standards and national adoption, but I can also see a place where individual investment decisions have to have something that's particular to the organisation. So all I'm doing is being very cautious by saying, just the old story, know the destination before you go on the journey. Don't adopt something before you know it's going to work. And I've seen this happen throughout my 46 years where we've lurched from one thing to another. Some organisations were probably in their 3rd or 4th type of asset information system. And I think it's simply because there was not the all of the planning that Jules has described in this webinar that went ahead before that. It's too easy to jump to a system, a software solution or a standard before you know whether it's going to be used.
Cool, thanks. Hey, Greg's made a comment rather than a question, and he said, please contact me if you are interested in picking up the ADS, that's the Asset Data Standard, I presume. We are making a push nationally through DIA. So Greg's from the Building Innovation Partnership, and thank you, Greg. And we'll send Greg's details to all the participants after this webinar, just to make sure we're all joined up. And I know there is, speaking to Greg last week, there's a lot of action in here. Another comment from Ashley. I'm going to read this one out. It's maintenance contract data collect is the Wild West. This to me is the biggest need for standardization. Activity types are hugely varied. Have you got any comments on that? It's probably a Rob question as well.
I agree.
It's in the Wild West.
Why have we had multiple systems when we're all lacking on historic data? You know, in the 1980s, I think Mitt Tansen was first approached. If we'd stuck to our guns and gone through on a consistent basis, imagine the data that this country could have to make decisions from operational performance. So I agree. We're failing in that area totally.
Very good. A question from Eric here. Interested in thoughts, recommendations for successful capture of opportunistic asset data from maintenance activities. Have you got any comments on that, guys?
I'd say, I know I've discussed this, particularly when it comes to condition assessment of buried assets. It's sad to think that we are losing opportunistic data every day. I totally appreciate why we are, and why, because of the pressure of work and people's priorities that often have the best opportunity to collect that data have got other things to do. I just think behind the scenes there's an education exercise from their managers to say that sometimes data collection might be actually more important than doing the job itself. And I'm particularly passionate about this because it's all very well prioritizing, for example, condition assessment work, and you have to, and you're probably going to focus on critical assets or where your risks are greatest. But all that opportunistic stuff can help determine those decay profiles for all your assets. Especially for assets that are in perfectly, they're not suffering from anything at the time. They just happen to be available to have a look at. So I think probably a bit of a coordinated effort across the country on how this is best improved would be a really valuable exercise.
Just one little on that around photos. I think photos are really powerful. You can do a lot with photos with machine learning now, and a lot of organizations, infrastructure companies are harvesting their vast collection of photos taken, whenever a site's opened up, to really be able to retrospectively determine lots of information about sizes and materials and defects.
Good, thank you. Barry Smith's made a comment saying the NTU also created a draft maintenance data standard. Is anybody looking back at this? Presumably that might be some of the things that Greg's looking into, or the industry as a whole. And just a comment that the NTU spent a lot of money and a lot of time developing all these things, and they are sort of accessible through Water New Zealand to councils in going forward with their reform process. So some of it isn't, but most of it is. So I think the best thing to do, if you are interested in that information, I think there was a webinar a couple of weeks ago, but if not, contact Gillian Blythe, who's the Chief Executive of Water New Zealand. Rob, do you want to comment?
No, again, I'm not aware of that maintenance data standard. I'm just, again, going to reinforce that message. Standards are good, but your needs dominate. And so make sure that the needs are met by the standards.
Yeah. Cool. Paul from Watercam mentions, for those who are interested in what maintenance data to record, have a read of British Standard EN ISO 1422/2006, collection and exchange of reliable of maintenance data for equipment, where there are maintenance KPIs. So it sounds as though that sounds as though it's British standard. And in the recording, we'll let you know what that standard is. Thanks very much for that contribution from Paul. Oh, and also another one, the maintenance KPIs, British Standard EN 15341 2019. En's asked a question, silly question. What does ADS stand for? Want to work out if we're keen or not. I think Asset Data Standards is the ADS. Thank you, Chris Miller, who answered that question. What an interactive bunch we are. But we need to draw a close. And we've all got to get back to work. So if you join me in thanking Jules and Rob for a really good talk. Thanks very much. There's some clapping on the screen. And if you want to discuss it further, if you could scan the QR code on the screen with a view to having a chat with Rob or having a chat with Jules or even having a chat with me if you like. But hey, thank you very much. And thanks for attending. There's been a lot of people and a lot of interest in this webinar series. And we're very proud to be leading in this area. And the support of Asset Dynamics and ProjectMax to the industry is well known. And have a great afternoon, everyone.